Yeah.
All right, we are live. Anyone want to send out a link
Yeah.
to
Going to.
our dozen of interesting fans?
Oh, look, it's beginning to.
Hey, you know what? If you do this one first and get it out there, we may be coming up with Google as like the first page. 'Cause there's not much .NET Core out there.
Yeah. There you go. Look at that.
A little incentive there for you.
All right.
All right, are we good? You ready, Chris? Are you still?
Tweet it out. I mean, hold on.
I haven't hit record yet, so. We all ready for the snow apocalypse?
Snow apocalypse. Yeah. I'm ready to see some snow.
20.
My daughters are
No.
dying to see some snow. We had the dusting. We had half an inch of snow, and they're like, "Let's go build a snowman." I'm like, "Yeah, it's not gonna work."
No, not quite. Well, you might have enough for 2 feet. You might have enough.
Yeah.
All
You might have to dig
there
them
it
out,
is.
but
Maybe Static Void Podcast would retweet it. But they have less followers than I do, probably.
Yes, absolutely. Static void.
I figure if I use the ASP.NET Core hashtag, maybe Damien Edwards will pick
yeah,
it up.
that's hot right now. It's trending.
we'll be trending by the end of
these
the day.
days, right?
Oh, interesting. Robert McLaws, when everything is core, nothing is.
That's true.
Yeah.
I was trying to think of a way, an acronym, something that would work with core.
That reminds
So
me of
CLR, common, I can think of anything for ORI. Something runtime. Common Owen runtime execution. We can make core be something.
for Windows.
.NET. .core.
2016.
Professional.
Cross-platform. Studio.
All right, are we ready to hit record?
Yes, let's hit record.
All right. 3, 2, 1, go. Hello, and welcome to the Static Void Podcast. I'm Jess Chadwick.
I'm Todd Snyder.
And I'm Chris Gomez.
And we are your hosts. We're recording this on the evening of January 20th, 2016, and yesterday Microsoft announced that they are officially renaming the new version of the .NET and ASP.NET frameworks to .NET Core 1.0 and ASP.NET Core 1.0 respectively. So tonight we're going to talk about what this new set of stuff is that's coming out and try and break it all down and see what all of it really means to us developers who are actually going to be consuming it. So, Chris, what is your take on this? What was your immediate reaction when you first read this blog post?
I thought it was a little late in the game to reintroduce it again, because you remember almost 2 years ago now at TechEd in 2014, they sprung upon the world that, hey, we're rewriting ASP.NET. That's essentially what they said, and for a while we were calling it vNext. And they said, no, we're going to call it ASP.NET 5, and that kind of seemed like that was end of story, right? But we're, just a couple months from RTM here, and there's been
end of Q1,
a pretty major renaming, not just to ASP.NET 5, which now is called ASP.NET Core 1.0, but really everything. Everything that's been encompassed by this whole rewrite, I think.
Yeah. How about you, Todd? What'd you think?
Well, I read about it last night before bed, so I was like, "Ooh, this is kind of interesting." Then slept on it. My initial take was naming is weird. I mean, I know Hansman talked about this in his post about how do you name things, and I guess my initial thought, I was less concerned about the 1.0 or the fact of keeping ASP.NET. If you go to Hansman's blog, there's lots of comments about maybe they should get rid of ASP.NET or come up with a different name. The part that kind of really, I'd say annoyed me but concerned me more than anything else is .core. Because I call anything .core, so .NET .core or ASP.NET .core. Because one of the big things that was outlined in they talked about a lot in Hensman's blog post was there's lots of confusion about what is ASP.NET 5, where does it relate to 4.6, and to me, putting the word core in doesn't solve that problem. It actually, to me, makes it much worse.
Yeah,
Having
core.
a 1.0 release sort of makes some sense, but having the word core, it seems to apply is what else is going to happen? Is more stuff going to get put in the core? And so it seems like there could be even more confusion. Um, so I don't
Yeah.
know. I wish we would have came up with a more creative name. I mean,
Yeah.
we used to always joke about that when they had Avalon and Indigo and stuff, how those names were very catchy, but then they ended up coming up with WCF and WPF.
Yeah.
So I guess we could have had the Windows Web Framework WWF or something.
Yeah, exactly.
Um,
It's even worse.
like
Well,
I said, I'm less bugs me about having ASP.NET stick in there, but the word core, it just
yeah,
seems like it's going to come back to bite them someday. That it'll be end up being something
Yeah,
else.
core meant something. I mean, when they were discussing .NET Core, you sort of had this understanding that, hey, this is a smaller version of the full framework. It's not 100 megs. It's going to be great for a cloud scenario and tiny VMs. But then the whole thing is called Core, ASP.NET Core, but ASP.NET Core 1.0 can run on the .NET Framework 4.6.
yeah.
Yeah, that was still not clear. It's like it's very confusing. Is ASP.NET Core, can that run on .NET 4.6 and Core CLR? Or sorry, Core.NET? Because that to me that was always the idea. I had that choice, and now it's like,
Yeah,
is that choice gone? It
right.
seems confusing. The
Yeah.
I
other
mean, if you're
thing is,
willing to read the blog post and look at this the revamped slide, then you can see that yes, you can run it on full framework 4.6, but uh, but it's
confusing.
ASP.NET Core. So
Yeah, exactly. You associate a name, and I always equate to back in the days of Silverlight, they actually had something called Core CLR, which is what Silverlight ran on. So again,
Mm.
it just seems like they've used this word core before. I actually think there's some assemblies in like Vista that were called core. So it just seems like that word has such a meaning to developers and things that I just feel like it's going to be more and more confusion. Um, the other problem is someone was talking to some developers today about this, and they said one of the things that to concern them was people have been used to trying to search about ASP.NET 5 and find information and things. Now they're going to have to start Googling for something else, and so they're going to not find stuff that's already out there. If they go to Stack Overflow, there'll be all this like things will be some listed things will be ASP.NET 5, some will be called Core. It just seems like Chris, you said it. It's kind of like 6 months ago they should have came up with a name.
well,
So
you're right up. You're onto something about maybe the word core. Like if I maybe be a little naive and say let's just say instead of core it said Shazam, right? And who cares what Shazam is? It's some catchy
yeah,
brand.
I always use the word Z.
You could
Yeah,
say ASP.NET Shazam 1.0 runs on .NET Framework 4.6, but it also runs on .NET Core 1.0. Does that help?
I think it's clear.
Or would that .NET Core 1.0 also need to be like .NET Shazam, where Shazam is, look, man, we've started over. It's awesome now. It's awesome and tiny. We got rid of so much cruft and baggage. You're gonna love us so much.
Well, I think that's it. That is it right there. Like we have started over. This is a brand new framework, and so the thing that's really confusing is that it borrows so much from the old one, including maybe not code. I think there is a little bit of literal code borrowing, but some of the APIs, some of the libraries, right? So when you go to the file library, right, or the file API, or the system.io API, like they're there, and they're the similar classes that you've known and loved this whole time with the full .NET, but they're completely rewritten. They're completely from scratch, right? And so it is a brand new framework that looks incredibly like the old one. And then that's the core .NET framework, and there I go using core, and I didn't really mean that to be any significance, but I
Right.
meant
I mean, like,
the
yeah,
base class libraries, right? The stuff
yeah,
that is at the
Common
core,
language.
is at the
the DCL.
foundation.
That's really important. Yeah.
Exactly, it's at the foundation of everything that you do, and that's the stuff that you build your applications on top of. And then you go up to ASP.NET, and now ASP.NET introduces things for working with web applications, handling web requests, and but it's not ASP.NET anymore, right? So when ASP.NET first came out, it was ASP.NET Web Forms, and that had a whole pipeline with HTTP modules and handlers, and none of that is there at all anymore, right? And
Yeah,
so
it's totally different.
it's a completely different pipeline. But a lot of the API, or I don't know about a lot in terms of quantity, but many of the same concepts are there, right? So you still have an HTTP request, you still have an object that's a request, and an object that's a response, and you might even have some of the same property names, but it's a completely new object, rewritten from scratch. And so I don't think that's really helping things either, because it's a brand new framework that looks a whole lot like the old one, right? So like in some ways it looks closer to Node than it does the old ASP.NET. And in other ways it looks exactly like the old ASP.NET, and it's just very confusing coming from 10, 15 years of ASP.NET development. It's kind of confusing to kind of figure out which is which.
So I've been thinking a little bit about .NET being announced in 2000. And I just have pretty vivid memories of that because I was at that PDC, and it was kind of a bombshell dropped on that audience. And all in the span of one show, right, one conference, they basically told developers, hey, there's not going to be a VB7. Instead, Visual Basic .NET is now a first-class language, and they use that terminology, a first-class language, right? They said we've got this new .NET framework, and VB isn't a stepchild. It's a first-class, co-evolving language, right along with this new C# guy, which is just a language that we are inspired from C and C++. They never said Java.
I was on that back too, and Java.
But and the funny thing about it is, at that conference, everyone was excited. The .NET name, the only thing that I think most of the attendees agreed upon was that the .NET name was kind of horrible, because they said, how does that make sense with the internet? You can't register .NET. And I'm just saying, this is what we said.
Yeah, no, I remember these things. Problem.
These were the things that we said around the breakfast table when you're meeting attendees, right? And yet, looking at it 16 years later, it's been phenomenally successful. Microsoft got us all. Those of us who worked at that time either worked primarily in MFC, ATL, and COM in C++, or you worked in VB6, and they got those two very disparate groups of developers to move together to .NET and to love them for it, which is remarkable, frankly. It really is. And they also got the classic ASP developers to move to this ASP.NET because it was just similar enough. There were still session objects and request objects and response objects. But by the way, we have this Visual Basic like experience in web form. So wonderful for you Visual Basic guys. Now you can make websites. Your boss has been asking you, how do we get browser based? Here you go. And we loved them for it. And now I just feel a lot of consternation this time around.
Yeah, that's an interesting parallel, because this is actually incredibly similar, except in the ways that are really frustrating, right? So at least when in the switch from ASP to ASP.NET, it wasn't touted as like the same framework, only a little bit better and slimmed down, right? It was, here's a brand new thing, and you can run your ASP.NET pages on it as a migration path, right? But it's a different model, and it's a different language, and it's a different way of interacting. In ASP.NET or in ASP, you wrote all of your code in the page, and then in ASP.NET and web forms, you now can have code behind and all of this stuff, right? Just a different way.
Yep.
And plus, you've now got this pipeline and everything. So, in one way, in this now next version or whatever, this new framework, now the pipeline is completely different, but the code is almost exactly the same, except for the parts where it's not, where it's really just annoying.
Yeah.
It's just different enough that you have to rewrite a bunch of stuff, and it's similar enough that you don't have to relearn a whole bunch of stuff, but it's just different enough that you can't just pick up your old ASP.NET applications, your ASP.NET 4x applications, and just bring them right over, right?
And how different? What has happened, I would say, to the Microsoft Enterprise Developer community that in 2000 you had excitement, and after watching some things recently like the Silverlight debacle, the Windows 8 debacle, the Universal Windows platform, which you just don't hear a lot of .NET developer shows talking about. It's not the same. It's the
Yeah,
excitement isn't there to be like, oh man, .NET Core, this is going to be great. It's going to be cross-platform. We could deploy on Linux. This .NET Native, which we've got to talk about that rename too, where I get native binaries. Where's the excitement?
Nobody cares about native anymore. It's all web development, at least in the development world, right? That's what that's what developers are really.
Yeah.
Well, no, more than the enterprise world. The development world in general is really concentrated on web development, and I'm making that statement without any backing facts at all. It's just
Yeah, no, I think we all
in
agree.
Jess's bubble.
The web is the universal
people
platform now.
at the very
So
least,
let
that's
me
all
cut-
I ever hear about. I'm not saying that other
Yeah.
stuff doesn't happen, but I think that's the answer to your question, right? I think this is just one more reinforcement of that. Like Microsoft goes up on stage and says, "We now have native compilation," and crickets, because the people who care about native compilation are in the back. Well, they're probably still in their office working. They didn't even hear the announcement.
We're excited for TypeScript nowadays.
You're not
So
getting
what are the
anything out of me this
components?
episode.
Yeah, so what are the components of
So let me-
ASP.NET here? This ASP.NET Core 1.0, right? There's some other renaming that went on too, right? So,
Yeah, EF Entity Framework 7 is now Entity Framework Core 1.0.
right.
Or EF Core 1.0 if you want to call it that.
And EF7
So
was a rewrite. It was a starting over.
Yes.
Owen Miller made that very clear.
Literally from scratch, but again, with, same as the ASP.NET stuff, is that it's still the same code first. It's not supporting it. They completely dropped the EDMX, the model-based approach, right?
Right.
Yeah, I think
Right.
that's
So
true.
it's only code first, at least for now, and I think that's the only plans they have. I'm not really sure, which is awesome because again, I think that's what most people used anyway. But it's lightweight, cross-platform. All of this stuff has a theme. I'll give them that, right? It seems they do have some kind of direction. I just wonder what that direction is, right? So are they trying to gain the market share of Node developers who want to code and deploy on Linux? Is that where we're going? Is that what cross-platform means?
Well, maybe it's a firewall for the Windows enterprises that are saying they're starting to take the peak. Hey, Linux is free, Linux is cheap, whatever your reasoning is to take a peek. Microsoft's offering you a migration path with skill sets that you might, you already. Sure, there's going to be some training on this new .NET Core, but if you're a enterprise decision maker, you're a CTO, VP of development, I think you can see the path forward this way. At least you can see a path forward where what you might have been considering is what you just said, Jess, is, well, I guess I'm going to have to tell my developers to just train up on Node and learn. And you're starting to use things that are completely off the rails now. You're saying, yeah, we're going to use Node. Let's have them taking a look at Mongo. And pretty soon you're not using the word Microsoft at all anymore. Not in any.
Microsoft doesn't care because it's Azure. They just want to sell Azure now.
But then what if you say, we might as well go to AWS then? Like, what if you just go full Monty, right?
Well, they're banking on Azure, right? They're banking on the platform that you will want to choose that over Azure or over Amazon. That's a separate conversation, right?
Whole other yes. I think a couple quick points here. One is, if you look at the bigger picture here, where does the ASP.NET team sit in the world? It sits under Azure, right? So Azure is a cross-platform system, right? It's not just Windows. They can run on PHP, they can run Linux, so it makes sense for them to have a story there.
They sell CPU cycles.
Huh?
They sell CPU cycles in storage. Right?
Yes.
Yeah.
The other big thing is, if you think about the enterprise, everyone buys Windows servers to run ASP.NET and stuff, but that's really not where the money is. The real money is SQL Server, BizTalk Server, SharePoint Server, Active Directory, Exchange. All those things aren't going anywhere. No one ever replacing Exchange. What they're doing today is they're moving to Office 365 because it's too much trouble to maintain Exchange. So long as Microsoft has a piece, they don't really care where their code runs or where their web framework runs. As long as if it's onto a SQL server, they're still getting SQL Server licenses. So I think a lot of that is tied into that whole licensing model thing. And real quick, I just want to jump back into Chris's comment before about why does all the excitement changed. I think a lot of that's to do with there's been so much stuff in the last 15 years that changed, right? We went from WCF was all the hot thing, and then all of a sudden WCF is gone. Silverlight was a hot thing, now it's gone. So I think we're all burned out from all the changes over time, and we don't really see the value. I think there's good value in what's coming in ASP.NET Core. I think they like the idea of getting rid of all the old stuff. I mean, think about it. In the core, or in the core, in .NET Runtime, what's in there? Remoting's in there.
You're right. There's a lot of crap.
There's so much WinForms. It's on my server. I don't need WinForms.
There's a lot of sins in there too. I mean,
yes. Or
I've seen the .NET Core developers say is there are mistakes in key classes like system.threading, and unfortunately you can't ever take them out, and so developers keep stumbling into the pit of mistakes, and let's get rid of them once and for all.
Too, that .NET Runtime is very much tied to a Windows version, right? Windows version Vista has a certain runtime version. So being able to take it out and tie it or release themselves from that dependency makes a lot of sense. I just think that the bigger problem is the naming. And again, the naming is irrelevant. The naming will fade away, and people will get the idea. I think one of the big problems, and I know we're going to want to dive into what is .core, is now we have ASP.NET 4.6. Microsoft has a hard time telling people, this is stable, but we're kind of done with it.
Yeah.
They seem like they want to play both ends of the stick. They're like, look at all the cool new stuff. But we're also at 4.6 over here. I mean, they did it with .NET 4.6. They did it with ASP.NET 4.6. They're like, web forms is still over here. Yep, we didn't get rid of it. They've done it with WPF. They're like, WPF is still over here. It's still relevant. We're never going to get rid of it. We're going to support it. But then they went some different direction. They're doing this across the whole spectrum. That, to me, is the bigger frustration.
And there was that was causing even more confusion, right? They were saying we're rewriting this. ASP.NET 5 is a rewrite of ASP.NET, and we're kind of changing the pipeline and all of this stuff. But we're still going to invest. We're still going to have new releases of ASP.NET 4.6, which again is basically effectively a completely different framework. It just shared the name, shared the branding.
The branding, yeah, that's a good definition.
Yeah, but it confused people. It's close enough to look incredibly similar, but different enough that it's just really the differences are frustrating. And then you throw on top of it Microsoft saying, we're going to continue to support 4.6. We're going to have new releases, bug fixes, and all of this stuff. And what does the next release of 4.6 look like? Right? Is that 4.7? And now they've taken 5 and they can't use it anymore. So you can never have a new major release of this other framework.
Or it's 6, or it's I'll skip 5, go to 6, or it's 10, or whatever.
It's
ASP.NET 10. I actually honestly think it's. I mean, you look at it, .NET. I hate to use core because I've always called it core. It's very stable, right? I mean, there's not a whole lot more they have to do to the framework. Them creating a new framework makes sense. Stream it down. Focus on the things that are relevant in 2016, not 2001, right? We don't need com interrupt in the core.NET now.
Sure. Well, the other thing they did here was that they hit the reset button on the versions themselves, the numbers themselves, right? So everything is now back to 1. So one of the things
which I have no problem with. I'm fine with that. That actually makes sense to me.
Yeah, but so one of the things was they introduced ASP.NET MVC many years ago, 2007 or something like that. And so MVC has now had its own version. So it's been MVC 1, and then MVC 2, and then MVC 3, which runs on top of ASP.NET 4.0, right? And then 4.5, and then 4.6.
7.
And then you throw Entity Framework in the mix, and that's Entity Framework version 6. And all of these numbers are mismatched, and I think to a community that was used to numbers aligning, it was a little bit of a shock, but I think, frankly, we all got over it. And it is its own project now, and everybody loves that. I know that's an incredibly...
Or NuGet made it easier. We just say NuGet, give the latest stuff.
Yeah, exactly, right? So it just really makes sense for ASP.NET MVC, that framework, to be versioned and live a separate life from the core ASP.NET or from Entity Framework, right? They are all their own libraries and frameworks, and it makes sense for them to follow their own revs. But so now we're hitting the reset button, and now we're all back at 1.0 again, and we're just kind of reliving that pain. I just found an interesting reason, right, to hit the reset button and have them all align, because they're very quickly going to become misaligned, and I don't really think anybody's going to care.
Yeah, you bring up an interesting thing that I sort of thought about that didn't fully grasp into what you just said. So ASP.NET Core is the core, right? That's the ASP.NET runtime. So now we have MVC Core 1.
Yep.
That's a framework on top of the runtime. So someday we'll have single R on top. Yes. They're both using ASP.NET Core.
Right.
That just sort of makes a little more sense. But again, I think the problem is they didn't explain it. They show a nice picture, but they didn't go into like, hey, this is core, and now we're going to stick these things on top.
Well,
I mean, the picture
so
enhancement has it. It doesn't even mention MVC. So
let's
it's like, is MVC
yeah.
part of core, or is it separate?
Let's get into that a little bit. So I'm looking at an InfoQ article here, which we'll link to in the show notes. But it says you need to know these terms. Core FX. This is the open source version of the .NET base class library. So this is basically the foundation. Like, this is your string classes and your string builder and the file, the I/O namespace and everything that I mentioned before, right? The foundational stuff. And then Core CLR. This is the open source cross-platform runtime. So this is the stuff this is the thing that runs your .NET code, right? And then you've got the .NET Core CLI. So this is a new thing. This is the command line interface, which is billed as the new command line experience for building and deploying cross-platform applications. So this is like this is Node, right? This is, instead of going to the command line and typing Node exe, Node start or whatever, you now type .NET restore, .NET start.
Well, now, I mean, I agree with you that it follows the Node model, but is there any other way to skin that cat if you want to be truly cross-platform?
What do you mean?
You want to run on Mac, you want to run on Linux, you want to run on Windows.
Any other way other than command line, you mean?
Well, you got to have a foundation, that CLI-based foundation. Otherwise, how do you do it? Except you start releasing a heck of a lot of different binaries, and now you're not really cross-platform.
Right. So you're saying that's the common...
Different platforms, different things.
I think it's that lowest common denominator that's a requirement.
Yeah.
But what has at least confused a lot of developers is that there's a lot of developers out there who are used to sharp tools. They look at Visual Studio as a sharp tool that does a lot for them, and because of the excitement over cross-platform, we've seen an awful lot of command line in our presentations, not just from Microsoft folks, from MVPs and speakers, and it's made a lot of people think like, why do I have to take this huge step back? But I don't think that's really what's happening. It's just that's how you get to cross-platform, is by having a CLI foundation.
Do you need to? I'm one of those presenters, by the way, right? I'm the one that jumps to the command line and uses it just because that's where I've always felt more comfortable. Do you need to use the command line? I mean, do you think the GUI story is going to remain strong, and if you are so inclined, you never have to touch a command line again? Assuming you're just building for Windows, building and deploying for Windows.
I would think on the Windows platform, eventually Visual Studio or Visual Code will have all the same things we expect. On the other platforms, who knows? I mean, I would tend to think that it's more the cutting-edge people who want command line or more than going to be satisfied just having something work, right? I mean, for me, the idea now that if I have someone come to me and say, hey, we really just don't want to pay for Windows, I don't now have to go, oh, well, let's use WordPress or let's go to Node. I have my skill set. I have a platform I can work with and deploy it both places. That's a benefit as a developer to me.
But you don't anymore. It's a new framework. You have
I meant I can deploy that same thing on Windows and Linux.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, I jumped on that statement that you know this new framework, but you don't. You just can't make that statement because you don't know the framework. You're going to have if you are, and I use this term very very cautiously, if you're an expert today in ASP.NET, the current ASP.NET 4.6 or whatever it is, you're going to have a learning curve, right? Even an expert in today's ASP.NET is going to have some kind of learning curve in getting up to speed on the new ASP.NET. It's not just you just transfer over.
But that learning curve is much more manageable than if I went over to Node. At least in my opinion.
I guess.
Well, I mean, here's the positive about command line. It's a feature we've been sorely missing probably for a decade. How many developers out there, even today, throw up their hands and install Visual Studio on the build server?
Yeah.
Now, it wasn't that long ago that was really your only way to build a build server. But I think today, if you really are willing to dig in, roll up your sleeves, and read a ton of documentation and dig and dig and dig and Google and Bing and whatever, and Stack Overflow and wade through all that, you can, oh, wait, hold on, I don't have to do that anymore. But that's really hard. And so the advantage that I think we will have coming out of this is because the foundation is command line and everything's built on top of that, that kind of gets us to a place where, oh, okay, so I can create a build tool chain without, the heavyweight IDE. At least we should be able to get there. I'm not sure that we'll be able to get there today, but I think that's the part of the goal, because there's not going to be a Visual Studio in Linux or in Mac, at least not anytime soon. The way we know of Visual Studio, it's too married to COM and Win32.
Visual Studio Code.
Right, but how long will that take Visual Studio Code? Does it even want to catch up to Visual Studio? Let's be honest. That isn't part of Code's philosophy is to be lightweight. I don't know that it wants to be Visual Studio.
I don't think anybody wants to make Visual Studio again. I think even Microsoft is a little uncomfortable with how big and bulky it is.
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge,
Sure.
it's a huge memory beast. I kind of always equate it to, they really want you to use Visual Studio to do your development, but they don't care where you deploy it, right? If I'm doing the bulk of my development in Visual Studio, and then I deploy it off to a server that's Linux, Microsoft makes out. They still get the license for Windows for me. They get the license for Visual Studio.
I don't think they really
To me,
care that much about selling Visual Studio licenses.
no, I mean, it's in the grand scheme of things, it's not important. What's important is market share or mind share, right? I mean, if you go to an enterprise, who are the big players? It's IBM and Microsoft, right? You might have Oracle and some other ones floating around. That mind share is important, right? I mean, they sell thousands and thousands of licenses of SharePoint every year. It's a multi-billion-dollar business. So just having that market share is, I think, what's important. Which ultimately, I think, gets back to why they're keeping the ASP.NET name. It's a name people know what that is, right? If they called it Cobra, everyone would be like, "What's Cobra? What's this new thing from Microsoft?" At least
Right.
having that name.
It's backfiring, though, because that's not what it is. It just looks a whole lot like it, right?
Yeah.
Well, I mean,
So a
I'm
red
looking at
panda is not a panda. It's just not. It's closer to a raccoon, right? But it's called panda, so they must be. Everybody thinks they're the same, but they're just not.
I mean, I'm looking at the CoreFX GitHub repo, and I'm seeing System.io and SystemLink and System.net, .http and System.reflection, and some of our old friends are here, right?
There's a few.
So you
I mean, the
mentioned,
pipeline
Jeff,
changed, right? We don't have handlers and modules, but I think most developers don't even use those or even knew they were there.
like you mentioned, Jess. So step one was CoreFX. We got that far. CoreFX is like the BCL. What else did that guy say we needed to know? Who's wrote that article again? It's the InfoQ article, right?
Yeah. Well, no.
Yes.
So I'm more frustrated at ASP.NET. So the .NET Core stuff, it's awesome. I've got no problem with that because
And
that
it makes sense.
It makes total sense. It truly is. Let's take the core.NET and just make it run cross-platform. That is all it is.
The only parts that are needed.
Exactly, the stuff that will be able, that makes sense to run cross-platform, right? So we're not going to bring in all that COM stuff, everything you were talking about earlier, Todd, right? We're not going to bring in that stuff that just doesn't matter anymore or only matters on Windows, because when you're on Mac, it doesn't make sense to do that stuff, right? So we'll leave it all behind, and while we're doing that, we'll also add some new tricks in, like native compilation and stuff like that. All of that is awesome. I have absolutely no problem with that, and that makes total sense to call that .NET Core, because it is literally the core of .NET. And now it's open source, right? The 1.0, whatever, that's still a little bit confusing, but what else are they going to call it, right? Putting the number, the version number, resetting the version number on an existing name is going to be confusing no matter what you do. But
yeah.
It definitely makes a whole lot more sense to call this thing .NET than it does to call it something else. And I don't agree with that at all when it comes to ASP.NET.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of us who've been kind of playing with this for a little while would be perfectly fine with them giving it a more catchier name. Yeah. I don't know, like I said, I used the word Cobra. We could probably come up with 100 different names. And if you listen to, I know, Chris, you did actually, did you attend the community stand-up or just watch the video? Because I just watched the video.
Yeah, I wasn't able to be there live, but I did watch the video after the fact,
Because they came out right
spent an hour.
We discussed lots of different ways. We came to this was the best solution for what we were trying to do. We spent time trying to figure out other names, and nothing made any sense. I just think now we're all going to use Core as something bigger than what it is.
Yeah, I guess. But if you look at those diagrams, you mentioned the diagram on Hanselman's blog, Todd, earlier. So we have this stack of stuff, and there are things that are just side by side, meaning they're replacements, right? And so you have the .NET Core libraries and the .NET Framework libraries, side by side replacement. You have .NET Framework 4.6 and .NET Core 1.0 side by side replacement, meaning you can take one out and like literally drop it in with the other one, and that other one, the .NET Core stuff, the new stuff, might have 60% of the API, but the 60% that's there pretty much exactly matches, more or less, what the existing one is, right? It's a drop-in replacement. And then you get up to the next level, which is the ASP.NET level, and now you have this is where the confusion comes in, because it's not the same framework, right? So now you say, well, ASP.NET 4.6 only runs on .NET Framework 4.6, but ASP.NET Core 1.0 runs on .NET Framework 4.6 or .NET Framework Core 1.0, and they're interchangeable, blah, 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 blah. It'd be easier if you said, we have this framework called Shazam, and it runs on .NET 4.6, and it runs on the new .NET Core.
Right? We can let them call it Shazam.net.
No. Yeah, sure, Shazam.net. Right? But I mean, it's a whole lot easier to digest than taking.
So should they call it Node.net?
What? Yeah.
Node.net.
Yeah, and then you can write everything in TypeScript.
Well, yeah, I mean, when ASP.NET was first come out, you could write things in JavaScript on the server.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think anyone ever did.
Yeah. I mean, what do you guys think about that? Am I in my own bubble here, or do I get any support with
No, I think you're right, and it would be clear from a messaging standpoint if that was, because it would be clear, like, this is something new. And I agree, I feel like I get back to when we all did the panel at the Philly Code Camp, and there are a lot of people that like, this seems totally different to me. I don't even know where to begin. So having a new name, I think would be better than calling it Core. So I don't know. I feel like there's just a lot of confusion and a lot of different things going on. It's crazy. The other thing that concerns me, and maybe it's when I think about the Universal apps, this picture looks a lot like the Universal app stuff, where everything was .rt, right? When Windows 8 first came out, everything was .rt. And it almost feels like, are we just doing that the same thing? And then eventually RT goes away, and the next version, in a year or two, we'll have ASP.NET Universal apps?
Well, hold on. So now there's a Core RT. I left it out earlier because I didn't want to talk about it, but there's a Core RT.
Well, yeah, I saw that too, and I'm like, no, you've already used that branding, and it didn't work.
In the InfoQ article, we've got Core RT. This is right underneath Core CLR. So Core CLR is the open source cross-platform runtime. Core RT is the runtime used by the natively compiled version of .NET. It's best known for its use in Windows Phone. So you guys were familiar with this. I had not even heard of this before all this hoopla. But you guys were previously, this was like a thing previously, Core RT?
Well, .NET Native was anyways.
Yeah.
It was sort of a thing. So they needed a new runtime, right? .NET really didn't work, but they still wanted to use XAML to build phone apps or tablet apps, Windows 10 apps, I guess you call them now, Windows Universal. So you have this thing called runtime, which allows you to interrupt into parts of .NET. And a lot of it was tied into this idea of security, that a phone or an app that goes in the store is a different kind of app. We didn't need the full .NET runtime, so they built a new runtime, and it was called Windows RT.
Okay.
But they also released a version of their Surface computer called Surface RT, and again, it ended up being all this confusion.
So if I'm developing for Windows
to do with
applications,
.NET Native though. I mean, so you're right. There was WinRT, which was
WinRT.
Us developers as the new runtime. What did it have? It had like language projection because it could take .NET, it could take C++, it could take JavaScript, and that's when
and still
people started saying .NET is dead. Like they started saying, oh well, that must mean .NET is dead. But what I'm thinking about is I've seen whispers at the last couple build conferences of something called .NET Native, and it's the kind of thing that would just show up in a whisper or in a little quick sidebar with Dan Fernandez or something. And it would be these really brilliant engineers who would come on and talk about how, yes, we're working to make .NET compile down to a native binary. And then they would show you, look how fast it starts up because it's native. It doesn't need to bootstrap the runtime. It doesn't need to bootstrap all the VM, whatever. And then when is this coming to developers? Oh, eventually. And then I think if I'm understanding this renaming correctly, that's .NET Native is now being called Core RT, and they're using the term ahead of time compilation, which
So is
sounds
that just a tool? Is that just a compiler? Is that a different way to compile my app? So today I compile it with the normal .NET compiler or with Roslyn or whatever I'm compiling it with, but then when I want to create a native version of it, I use this executable. I mean, is this anything I have to care about when I'm developing my application? Do I have to code differently?
I don't think so. I think, at least what my understanding was, you just code to core.net, and then you now can basically compile your code to native code, and then deploy it natively.
Okay, so I only ever need to care about this if I actually care about native applications.
Yeah,
That's
right.
my understanding.
I mean, Core RT is the runtime. .NET Native is still the compilation tool chain. So
right. So it's the Core RT is the thing that runs inside of the executable that's produced. Is that?
Yeah, I would think that it's equivalent to
Kind of
like the old days you said the VB runtime. This is the actual runtime. When you
Right.
compile natively, this is what executes it.
All right, that makes
think.
sense, I guess. Right. So, but as a developer, it doesn't change the way I code or think about my code or anything.
I
This
don't
is
think
more
so.
of a runtime concern.
I mean,
Don't think so. Not.
there's
I mean, the logical conclusion is we start running across different platforms. We have the same problem that Java has, right? Write once, debug everywhere. Something will work great on my Windows development machine, but now I've deployed it to some Linux distro, and the threading model is slightly different, or there's a memory leak, and now I have to figure out what's going on.
Yeah, no,
So,
I understand. I mean,
I don't know if you can't ignore it, but from the day-to-day coding thing, you probably don't have to master it or understand all the details.
so there's a site at .NET spelled .github.io, which is the .NET Core site. And the way they describe it on there is they say .NET Core manages memory with a garbage collector, compiles your code with a JIT compiler, or ahead of time with .NET Native. So it is that whole idea of saying, instead of the just-in-time compilation model that we've all become accustomed to, and expecting that little performance hit on startup, we think we can get rid of that or whatever. So
this is a really nice site, by the way. .net.github.io. It's a really nice site.
So, it's made some changes to the naming of, instead of having an MVC 6, now it's going to be MVC Core 1.0. And it was going to be weird anyway, because ASP.NET 5 was going to include MVC 6, because MVC 5 had already shipped. And MVC 6 is a unification of Web API, which was currently sitting at Web API 2.2. So now you build a Web API with the same framework you might build a server-side web app with. My question is, who among us is just chomping at the bit to start using MVC as a server-side web framework with views? Or is it, well, yeah, I mean, I might use .NET, and I might even use ASP.NET and C#, and I might even use this MVC core, but I'm going to use it to write web APIs. How common is that sentiment right now?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I've ever said this on the podcast before, but in the very early days of it was called ASP.NET vNext back then.
Right.
We had a hackathon, and everybody got into a room, and at 9 o'clock we started, 9 a.m., and then at noon, at lunchtime, I paused and I realized that I had spent half of my morning writing my Angular app and the other half of my morning writing my web API. Yeah. Using controllers and ASP.NET MVC as just handling back data, and I was never rendering a view. All of my views were static HTML and JavaScript SPAs. I'm not sure how representative of that is in the world. I mean, I know in my current organization we are pushing hard for all of our server-side stuff that's being actively, maintained and increased, or new features being added to go more toward a SPA model.
Yeah, that's pretty much what I've done the last 2.5+ years.
Yeah.
Occasionally
that's just our bubble, right? That's where we.
Well, I think that's partially true. Certainly, if you just kind of scour the internet, you're going to see that's where, I mean, what magazine are you going to pick up that's going to be talking about server-side web development? And that goes for anything. Forget Microsoft. I mean, that talks about like, Spring over in the Java world or something. That it's all become, oh my gosh, you should be learning Angular. But I still think there's a lot of web development shops out there that maybe some of it is that they don't have the training, or it's just like, do we really need this for our little website? I don't know. We may be in a little bit of a bubble there, being on a leading edge.
I think it mostly comes down to what you're most productive in, right? If you're most productive, especially when you're creating that little stupid app, right? If you're most productive in writing a SPA and you don't have any major kind of performance concerns of shipping data back and forth and everything, then it's just write what you know, which I also think is a big reason for Node really taking off, because if you're writing web applications in the browser, JavaScript, and
you
so
keep using it.
Just keep using it. Just make it, right?
And solution.
Yeah, but so I also wanted to mention just that even in this completely SPA world, there's still room for server-side rendering. It's just far less.
Yeah. I mean, I typically always do my homepage. Still is not always server-side rendering, but I still have a home Razor view, just because I always found it to be just a better way to get started in the application. Instead of having index HTML, my index HTML is the Razor view with a few things that are on the server. I mean, I don't even know how to refer to it. Well, I'm just going to call it MVC next because that makes the most sense to me. They're adding HTTP. They're not HTTP helpers. What do they call them? HTTP. There's some way they reimagined the way helpers were going to work. I can't remember what they're called now.
Tag helpers.
Tag helpers. You're right. Yeah.
Right.
With the intent of basically helpers required you to put a lot of C# code in.
Right.
In
a lot
HTML,
of Razor code. Yeah.
Where tag helpers basically makes it you can make any tag be C# code.
Pretty
it's
much,
much more straightforward. It's much cleaner.
Yeah,
it's more declarative. I mean, all that's kind of cool and interesting. And I know in the stand-up call, they actually were talking about something called visual components or something. They were talking about something else that sounded like it was part of MVC next too. So
I mean,
it doesn't go away
to user controls. The visual components.
Yeah, maybe I wasn't sure.
Conceptually, they're basically just user controls.
Yeah. So I think what a lot of people try to do too much is they want this I'm X or Y. You need to build the right solution for the right problem you have. And you can intermix them. There's no reason you can't intermix things. Just got to do it correctly.
Well, I agree.
Or not over-engineer.
And I think one thing that I don't know if it has to do, I don't know what it is, but there does seem to be this mind shift that there's a lot of people out there promoting a right way to do things, and then they argue like, oh, well, you want to do everything this way. You'd always want to use React. And say, okay, I guess. I mean, really? I mean, what if and I like using the live.asp.net site as an example, because as Damian Edwards pointed out, there's nothing really super special about it. He, in fact, hated the fact that he needed model view controller. Right? Putting words in his mouth, I'm pretty sure that's what he said on the stand-up was, why couldn't this have been with the old web pages type model, just a little bit of code in line in some static looking HTML, and voila, all I'm doing is showing you YouTube thumbnails. That's all I'm doing here.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not building a site to go shopping for cars and change the interior and something really, really immersive.
You don't need a server-side stack really to make all that work.
Yeah. So it's interesting to me to see, there's a lot of investment going into reimagining the server-side stack and reimagining EF. And if you're really embracing cloud, if you're really, really embracing it, are you even thinking a database server anymore, or are you starting to think about just some, simple storage, whether it's Amazon's or Azure's table storage, or I don't know.
So I'm going to refer back to something that Jess a few podcasts ago gave me credit for about the first time we heard about cloud. Servers or an architecture is the solution to many problems. To me, cloud is just another implementation of that. So I always think in endpoints. Now, the endpoint may be a MongoDB database somewhere, or maybe some other NoSQL database, or Amazon, whatever. But to me, if you think in a layered end-tier architecture and you think in this is just an endpoint, you then decide, all right, am I building this endpoint myself, or I'm going to consume something that's already available?
Right. Well, and when you take that thought path a little bit further, that's kind of where we're going with the idea of microservices. Is that each of those
Yeah, I mean,
endpoints
that's
can
exactly
be
what they are.
it's a deployable unit, and it doesn't matter what the implementation is. So one endpoint, one microservice could be .NET, one could be .NET Core, and another could be Node, and they interact right through standard
I mean, Service Bus and
interfaces,
all the other
i.e.
ones,
REST.
they kind of have that same mentality. It's orchestration and stuff like that. So
Yeah, right. But my question is, the reason I use .NET now is because I'm familiar with it and because I have a whole Windows Server infrastructure. Once I go to the cloud, why would I and I choose Linux for whatever reason? Why would I choose .NET instead of Node? Right? If I'm already writing web applications and I'm already becoming an expert, and I'm using air quotes with JavaScript on the client side and the DOM. Why wouldn't I just jump onto the server and continue on? And yes, you don't just need to know JavaScript. You need to know the Node framework and the Node APIs and everything there. But other than learning a new framework, why wouldn't I use that, right? In other words, I'm attacking the cross-platformness of .NET.
yeah.
Right? By the time I'm going to Linux, why do I want to bring .NET along with me? Is the only reason because I already know it?
Maybe
if I
So
don't
I
know
actually
it,
have, I actually have a case where this is something I'm considering over the next year, and depending on the stability of what is now ASP.NET Core, we may go down that path, or we may have to look at something else. And that's simply I have a situation where we have existing .NET code base, and people have started to come and ask, well, you know what? It'd be nice if we could run this in our Java environment. And they don't really care what it's written in. They just want to be able to run this on non-Windows. So to me, that story makes sense, right? I could have one core code base that I could run on .NET 4.6 and .NET Core, and then deploy it wherever I need to or wherever the customer chooses to deploy it, right?
these are native
that makes
apps
a lot
you're
of
talking
sense.
about.
This is server side. I'm talking about server side.
Server side web applications?
Web applications, yes.
Why do they care about that?
Well, they don't have existing. Their infrastructure is all Java based. So Linux, Java, they don't have Windows servers. So when they want to use this product we have, they now need to deploy a Windows server to make it work today.
Just seems like buying that product is an interesting decision.
Well, I mean,
that's a whole other story, right? But I mean, I use SharePoint as an example, even though they probably will never make SharePoint work with .NET Core, right? If SharePoint ran on Linux, it would be cheaper to buy SharePoint because you wouldn't need a Windows license, or WordPress, or anything you would potentially could have could be rewritten in there. I think for the most part, most people are going to pick one, right? They pick a platform. I think people pick their server host on Windows, so I'm going to write in .NET, more than they pick the framework. Right? I'm not using Windows because I'm writing .NET. I'm writing .NET because I'm using Windows.
That's exactly my point. So why would I use cross-platform .NET, specifically ASP.NET?
Partially because it's there. That's partially why, right? But second, I think Microsoft's going to have to win a battle of performance here, and you can see the ASP.NET team's already doing that. They've crossed 1 million requests per second threshold. They believe that there's no reason why they can't compete with Java frameworks that are doing similar numbers. And the Core CLR team or the .NET Core team, I think they're going to have to kind of eventually fight that battle too and say, you're not just picking us because you're familiar with .NET on Windows. It's because we're also offering you something you're not going to get with Java on Linux or with Node on Linux. And I think they're going to have to make that case. They might not have to make it this year, but at some point, I do think part of this is establishing a beachhead in Linux.
So what is that case? Can you make that case?
I think the case eventually. Okay, so remember how the case always used to be with Microsoft that we run best on Windows, things run best on Windows, right? I think eventually the case that's going to have to be made is .NET is beating the pants off other people on Linux, and I think that's what the core team is going to work on. They're going to work towards that day. I don't think they can just throw it on Linux and say like, okay, because you've got to change some people's minds. You've got to change.
So the case is performance.
That's one. I don't think that's the 2016 story. The 2016 story is it works, and Windows devs, you can move your, you can preserve your. It's about preserving investment.
Yeah.
But in the future, in order to remain relevant, I think that is going to have to be a front that's opened up, because you can't just simply go invest in these other platforms and not eventually try to get mindshare for actually really living on those platforms. Otherwise, why did you do it?
I don't think that holds up. The performance argument holds up. I don't think people really care about performance that much at that level, right? So the difference between 300,000 and 500,000 requests per second, like the majority of us don't have that problem, and if we do, we're probably using some other framework or we're using it in a far different way. And so, as long as it is performant enough, it could be twice as slow as the next one, but as long as it fulfills the majority of the needs.
Well, I think that one of the things the ASP.NET team found out is they weren't twice as slow, they were 20 times slower.
But they have been, right, this whole time, and it's still
Right.
incredibly successful framework. That's exactly my point. And so we're focusing on that, right? And so we're saying if one of the selling points is speed on Linux, well, I've already got that with, let's say, Node, right? Or these other frameworks that are incredibly fast, right? If performance is my top priority, I'm going to go and pick a high-performing framework and learn it and use it.
Well, is it super easy for a shop to just, I mean, a big enterprise to just say, okay, we've got this army of .NET developers, and what are we going to do, retrain them? I know that for a lot of us, our natural curiosity is going to lead us to learning about these things.
Right.
But then there's a lot of developers where that's just not true.
Well, we're retraining anyway, right? That's the point I was making earlier, is that, this is a new framework, and it looks a whole lot like the old framework, but we're retraining anyway. Especially in the enterprise.
But isn't that learning curve much more manageable, right? I mean, when I went from web forms to MVC, there was stuff I had to learn, but I still had system.web, right? I could still have HTTP context. There was familiarity there. It wasn't like I had to learn a whole other platform. And the funny thing is, I actually think developers, once they start using this, they're going to continue. Most will end up continue running on Windows. They'll never run on Linux because they don't have that need. But by having people get to this level, what Microsoft has done is now they've made it so, like, hey, if your boss all that comes to you and says, you know what, we're going to go build a new logging service or whatever else you need, and you have to deploy it to Linux, you don't now have to go learn something else. You already have these core skills. Just write it in an ASP.NET Core and then deploy it.
I'm not getting these scenarios, right? I don't have a boss where today I'm deploying to a Windows server and tomorrow he's going to come and ask me to make a Linux.
Well, I get it. I think every situation is different. I ultimately take all this is about Azure, right? Azure is a cross-platform environment. They want to own. When you run on Azure, they like you to run in .NET. They don't care what OS it is. That's been my sort of view since the beginning.
I'm not even sure I agree with that. They want you to run Azure, and they want to use their CPU cycles. What do they care what framework you're using?
No, but having that story, they got to have a story, right? If you have a story, it's much. Then Chris said a bit, why not go to Amazon? If I have a story that says our .NET runs on every platform super fast on Azure, pay us to keep it running on Azure as opposed to picking up Node and going to AWS. Right?
Yeah,
that's the real
Why not
story.
just pick up and go to AWS? I mean, there's a little bit of mindshare here. Is you're showing leadership and convincing people to, well, boy, let's just stick with Microsoft all the way through. I mean,
on
otherwise, well, who cares? We'll stick with Microsoft all the way through on using Azure. And here's the other thing about Azure, right? Is there's a whole lot of platform as a service that a lot of people are still reluctant to look at. When now I don't care what it's running. Quite literally, when you deploy using, let's just pick something like Azure Service Fabric or something, who cares? Like, do you even want to know what Azure Table Storage is running on top of? Does it matter to you? It might be Windows, it might not.
As long as it works, it does what it needs
as long
to
as
do.
it works, and that's the PaaS story. That's the platform as a service story. And I still think that I mean Microsoft could. I'm just trying to figure out, why are they doing the cross-platform? They can't just be for their health. There's got to be, and in fact, considering that they've got the .NET team cranking on .NET Core, there's folks like if you watch the videos from MVP Summit that are on Channel 9, you see Stephen Tobe coming up on stage to talk about the Linux work. Here's the guy who was out there talking about async await and was kind of one of the masterminds talking about the task parallel library. A pretty top level sharp guy. Why? There's definitely I don't think they're just doing this. It's not a feature to check a box. There's some plan here, and I think some of it is to push developer mindshare out past Windows, because it's probably one big giant hedge. Which of these things is going to become irrelevant over the next decade? Is it going to be .NET? Is it going to be Windows? Is it going to be ASP.NET? I don't know. Any of them? All of them? None of them?
I think too. Some of it is also, think about it. If they didn't do this, what would they be doing? What in ASP.NET or regular .NET do they need to do? Right? They can give us new type, more libraries and things like that, but ultimately it kind of like it does everything we needed to do, or does 90% of what we needed to do. So I think some of it has to do with the fact that they need to keep building things. Right? We're developers. If we don't keep building new things, you lose market share. That's just the nature of things. Something else too I thought was interesting is, what was Azure's big thing a couple years ago? They made Node. They rewrote Node to read as fast as possible on Azure. And once they had it, they're like, at least this is my opinion, they're like, now we have this. I wonder if we can make .NET do this and make it really fast and put it on Linux.
Again, we're back to
that's
the
how sort of I
performance
equated
thing.
to it.
Yeah, I don't know. We're back to the performance thing. I just don't think performance is top
ultimately
on people's
scale,
mind.
right? I mean, all this is, and even think about this too. They changed the name. What are people doing today? They're talking about it. By just talking about positive or negative, right? There's no idea of negative news. By just talking about it, it gets market share. Things are happening.
So this is a
But if they were just
marketing
sitting around going, "Oh, we're going to release SP5 for Visual Studio 2013 today," people are like, "Whatever. I don't really need it." They got to keep releasing new stuff. It's just the nature of the software business.
You're not saying they just did this rename as a marketing gimmick, or that was one of the reasons?
No,
I think that
don't
right
so.
now is part of marketing gimmick.
I think
At least
that
that's my
the
opinion.
fact is every time they go out to talk about this, they get a lot of blank stares, and they've noticed it, and they understand it, and their community partners are screaming at them. People
Yeah.
like MVPs are screaming at them, saying, I can't message this. I'm going to user groups, and everyone's crickets in the room, blank stares. No one understands it.
Yeah, and
So they
this
take
doesn't
another
help.
stab at it.
And it doesn't help.
Well, so could they have done anything? Like, did they do damage today? How's that? Do you think they did any damage? Generally
No,
speaking.
I think they
I don't
probably
think
took a
so.
step in the right direction.
Right.
Yeah.
Like it's
Well,
a
in a week or
little
two,
bit
we'll
better
be
than it
on
was
something
before.
else.
Maybe a painful step, right? But maybe. What else? I mean, I don't know. Sometimes, if you really stop and think about it, what else were they going to do? And we've been using they've talked about calling it Foo 1.0. We talked about calling it ASP.NET Shazam, which is the same thing as Foo.
Yeah,
Just
whatever.
insert name here. But
I guess look at it this way: if they have core and then they start building MVC on top, and then CO, or then I can't remember what it's called right now off the top of my head. The damn it, what's it called? Um, or any other pieces, web pages, right? You put web pages on or Signal R on top of core, and they have their own version numbers. It makes more sense. If everything is in the umbrella of core, 3 years from now they're gonna be like, "Well, we gotta call it something else because it's more than core now. It's Shazam. It's everything."
I agree that there's a danger. There's a danger even calling .NET Core for that reason. I completely agree with you there.
Where does the division side? Are we now going to have
What happens if
.NET
someday
Core ADO?
someday somebody
Is Core
decides
just another piece of the namespace?
right, some smart people at Microsoft figure out that they can get, and I'm going to pick on it, they can get WPF running cross-platform. Now is it .NET Core because you've gotten the graphical environment running? I mean, let's just say that was figured out, right? So is it still .NET Core? I agree with you that there's some funny weirdness there, but by then maybe it'll have a new name like Shazam or something.
Who knows? One more thing before we get close to wrapping up. One thing I think is very hard or needs to be figured out, and hopefully maybe some of it will with the renaming, is it's very hard to figure out today. Do certain things work, right? I had a developer came to me. He's like, "Hey, I see there's Entity Framework tied into vNext, but I don't want to use Entity Framework. I want to talk to a MySQL database." And I'm like, "Well, I wonder if you can just use Core ADO." And it was almost impossible to find that answer. I came across something called SQL Common, which I think is part of .NET Core, but it's very confused to me whether it is or not. So I think that's the bigger pain point. The name people will get over. It's going to be all right, I want to use this. I'm used to working with ADO.NET, or I'm used to doing whatever, WCF stuff, whatever framework you're used to doing, doesn't exist.
Right. No,
And if
I
it doesn't
totally
exist, what
agree.
do I use? That to me, I think is the bigger pain point.
Right. I mean,
Longer term, bigger
as
pain
I
point.
looked in CoreFX, I saw a system.data.sql client. What does that
Yeah.
mean exactly?
Well,
I don't know.
Go to that
Yeah.
.net.github.io. There's an API reference, and it's got all of this stuff right here in a nice little read.
Yeah, there's a
You don't even
SQL
have to.
Server class.
Yeah,
There's a data reader. But
Right.
is it
not.
there already? I mean, there's code, so I
There's
assume
not a
it's there
SQL
somewhere.
Server. There's not a SQL Server class. There's a SQL connection string builder.
I have a SQL data record underneath Microsoft SQL Server. There's an
SQL
API
data
reference. If you go to core, there's an API reference, and the second one down says SQL Server.server.
Microsoft.SQLServer.server.
Yeah, sorry, Microsoft SQL Server, yes.
Yeah.
And there's a data reader. And it's very convenient. They actually have vSource. You actually can see the source on GitHub. It's kind of cool.
That is actually kind of nice for those times when you wonder what's happening underneath. But let me ask you guys this: how excited are you for the days when you're pulling source down from GitHub? Is that gonna be a thing, or are we gonna say no? I don't want to get. That's not where I want to live.
That's how Node does it.
I know that's a common thing in the Linux community. Is we'll just build from source, right? Like, why can't you build from source? You're a developer, and it's.
I'm not saying build from source. I'm saying you have these packages of precompiled binaries, but they represent the current source that's in GitHub, right? They are one in this. They're not literally the same. They are outputs. They're compiled outputs, but it is the same thing that you can go and see on GitHub.
And a lot of people build from source anyway in that world.
Yeah.
They'll even brag. I mean, that's the right way to do things.
Had a sort of caution of a double-edged sword. The minute that .NET became open source, it's like, cool, this is great. If I have a problem, I can fix it. But then I started thinking, like, there's lots of crazy developers out there. They're going to fork that code and think they can create this master thing, and all of a sudden I'm going to be stuck trying to support whatever they've created. So I could see Enterprise One having their own version of .NET Core, whatever we're talking. So I think, like anything else, it potentially could become a nightmare.
I agree.
There isn't one true thing.
Can we as a podcast, as a team right now, go on record and say do not ever fork the .NET framework or .NET Core and make changes and have your own version?
No, if you want to work on something, you work with them to get it put into the core library.
That's the whole idea.
Fix the core library. Don't go forking it and create the Shazam .core .NET library. And
just don't.
But you know what's going to happen, right? I mean,
Yeah,
it's going to happen. And then it's going to be even more confusing.
I don't think
some developer will go somewhere and he'll like, I got the code from GitHub, and then I'll come over and I'm like, wait a minute, this is Shazam's version of .NET. You're not using the right thing.
I really don't think that will. It may happen here and then you might edit a couple lines, but yeah.
Yeah.
I do think it's nice to be able to have the source easy to look at, though, because a lot of times you can learn from the way things work. You say like, well, gosh, I wonder how SQL client is doing something, because that seems really important, and then you go look and you go, oh wow, and it might lead you down a
yeah.
And all of a sudden using things like, hey, I didn't even know that existed in the library. So anyway, I think in a nutshell, us talking about it was a good thing, because I think for a while a lot of people were kind of taking a step back and sort of waiting for RTM to come out, and I kind of the bigger picture to me is when this comes out, whether it's Q1 this year or Q2, whatever comes out, is it really something I can use today, or am I going to have to wait a year for more stuff to come in there in order to be able to use it?
Yeah. And I know. What do you think? Does this renaming help you at all, or is it all very confusing? I mean, are you going to use it? Are you going to use it in Linux? Are you excited about the cross-platform stuff? We'd love to know. Please leave a comment on the website, staticvoidpodcast.com, or send an email to comments@staticvoidpodcast.com. And as always, if you have a topic you'd like us to discuss on the show, please feel free to let us know through those same channels. We want to make sure that we're talking about the things that you want to hear about. So, Todd, Chris, thanks for the chat.
Yeah, thank you.
It's fun.
And thank you, listener, for spending the time with us. We hope you enjoyed it, and we look forward to seeing you next time on the Static Void Podcast. I'm sorry, I thought you were done. Yeah, .core.net 1.0. You were done?
I'm done. Yeah.
You kept on talking, but you were done. Yeah, Chris, I assumed you were done.
Yeah, I was done.
We just kind of died.
Well, I think we circled around once in there.
Yeah.
That's why I tried to do a quick summary.
Yeah, that was good. I don't really think it needed a summary. I think it was a conversation, and the conversation was done, and we just cut it off. Yeah.
I think we all kind of. It's funny. We didn't disagree, but we were not argumentative, but very opinionated with this one.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think we're all kind of in that same thing. It's just like, all right, and you needed to rename it. You just didn't pick the right name.
Yeah.
So
Shazam.net.
Well, so
speaking of other
for me,
things,
what it's revealed is that I think it's revealed the problem that .NET has. It's
much
growing.
more-
It's growing old with its community, and that community is going to retire. And then what?
Yeah.
'Cause what are the youngsters?
we're going to be able to
working
write COBOL.NET code forever.
on? Well, there is that, right?
COBOL.core.net.
Maintaining the existing .NET code because all the whippersnappers are like, "What? What's that .NET?" And you're raking
What's
in
that
the
web
big
form
bucks.
stuff?
Yeah,
View state. What's view state?
but
What was the thing? Oh, today I had a developer. It's like we were explaining that we had one website we were working on that had frame sets. And she goes, "What are frame sets?" I'm like, "Oh my god, I finally found some developer who doesn't know what frame sets are."
Thank you. Thank you for not knowing
Yeah.
what frame sets are.
Exactly.
It's better than
So
me
real
having
quick, I didn't
to
want to bring up
unlearn
the
for you.
recording, but it would be interesting to bring it up. I didn't get a chance to do research when we have our next one. Someone told me that Stack Overflow is changing their licensing model, that you need to credit things now if you copy the code. You guys hear anything about that?
I don't know. Sure.
I just thought it was interesting.
I haven't heard that yet, but I believe you that it's out there.
Someone mentioned it to me, and I'm like, and we equated it to that most people that would blindly just copy stuff off there would more than likely wouldn't reference it anyhow. Because I was like, it's not a bad thing. It's probably practice, right? If you're taking some code off the internet, you probably should make a reference to it. Hey, I got this here. Here's the context, so I'm choosing to do X. But then we go like, well, actually, most developers who blindly copy stuff off Stack Overflow probably wouldn't credit anyhow. It's too lazy, or they won't take credit for it. I don't know. It came up, and I'm like, that's interesting. I didn't realize they were thinking about changing it.
It's going into proprietary code anyway, 95% of the time, 99% of the time. But why? I mean, their boss knows that they got their work done. What more do you need to know? I'd probably just.
Well, I guess there probably are things that are ending up in open source now, or because a lot like .NET's open source now, maybe there are some things in there that came from Stack Overflow.
Yeah, right.
I heard a rumor that when it came to porting the .NET code, the APIs, that they weren't. Basically, the lawyers all sat down and talked about it, and they said the developers can't copy and paste. They have to actually type keystrokes. Now, if that means reading from one monitor and typing on the other, that's fine. But in order to protect the previous intellectual property, they had to actually type the keystrokes in. They couldn't just say like, oh, well, this snippet of code isn't changing. Control-C, Control-V. I don't know if that rumor is true, but
Perfect.
it's a great wives' tale that we can all tell. Probably a complete lie, but it'll be more fun to say that it was true.
It is. In my limited knowledge of the law, intent is a lot of it.
Yeah.
Right. So if you're looking at the screen and whether or not you copy and paste it with your mouse or with your fingers, it's the same code. Especially if you're talking IP. If you're copying IP, the IP is not the characters on the screen. The IP is the
What it does, yeah.
Yeah, the patterns, the formula, not even what it does, but how it does it specifically.
Yeah, definitely.
So even if you have different keystrokes and you name different variable names, if it's still the same thing, then it's still the same IP. I mean, this is coming from those IP lawsuits in the beginning of the year from Linux, or not the beginning of the year, beginning of the century, is what I meant to say. From Linux, where they were saying, there was just a big one like a couple of years ago, 5 years ago, where they were saying, like they looked at the code and clearly somebody copied and pasted and just changed the variable names. And the ruling was, yeah, of course it's the same code, right? Just because you change the variable names doesn't mean anything.
Is
Didn't
120
Google do that with Android? They did something
Well,
from
the lawsuit that's going on right now?
Yeah, 120 is us.
Okay. Oh yeah, just because it's 121 doesn't mean we started it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. What bothers me the most about all of this is the fact that there isn't very much excitement. Makes me believe that it's because it's not very relevant.
Yeah, it's not relevant, and it's too overly complicated. Not to say it's difficult to learn. It's just like, why, right? You just made a whole new framework, and I got to learn this thing, and I'm just really not excited about it. It doesn't give me anything more. It doesn't give me anything more than ASP.NET 5 now.
But
Well,
it did two things.
4.6, you mean?
It destroyed web forms and got rid of VB. Those are good things.
Well, no, VB's going
Yeah, they're going to add it back now.
VB's coming, and web pages are coming.
Web pages
Yes,
are coming.
which
Yeah.
will,
Yeah, so right.
web pages are coming. Oh no.
All it did was take away functionality and change the pipeline. Right at the end of the day, that's all it did, and it gave me cross-platform support. Who gives a shit?
Well, I guess to me is the idea that if the pipeline is faster, then when I build my web APIs, there's less overhead. That'd be a bonus.
Okay, well, we're back to the
I don't know.
performance thing, right? Are we really going to sell this whole framework on performance? I'm not going to buy a framework based on performance. It's just not going to happen. If it is
Well,
performance,
I've heard lots of people that said they've switched to Node and then realized the Node didn't have good performance. So
You can definitely screw up Node.
right? And how popular is that now?
yeah, I think anybody can screw up any platform
Yeah,
if you don't know what the hell you're doing, or if you jam out something.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I look at it as it's interesting stuff, but no, it's not like I need to learn it today. Angular 2 to me is a more compelling thing to focus on and learning.
There it is. Yeah, and
It's
you can learn just enough to make your web APIs.
Yeah, no, I mean I like to learn a little more than that, but yeah, I mean I'm not going to change how I build apps. I'm going to still build ordinary architecture. We use web APIs, whether it's core ASP.NET or what we have today. There's really not, to me, going to be anything.
Yeah.
No difference.
All right.
How I approach it.
12:30. Thanks
So
for taking
turn off.
This what? What were you saying?
I said turn off the broadcast. We should talk for 2 minutes about something else.
All right. Bye-bye, one viewer.